Over the past few weeks, the conversation around Sean Diddy Combs has stopped feeling like an isolated scandal. What began as a single case is now being compared to a much broader pattern involving power, protection, and unanswered questions inside the entertainment industry. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened as people started revisiting old interviews, past scandals, and the way similar stories have unfolded before. And one moment in particular pushed that conversation even further into the spotlight. During a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan didn't accuse anyone directly. Instead, he pointed out a recurring pattern that many viewers found unsettling, not because it named specific people, but because it raised the same uncomfortable question we've seen before. Why do cases like this so often stop before reaching the very top? Joe Rogan's name keeps coming up in these conversations for a reason. His podcast has become one of the few spaces where long-form discussions don't get immediately reduced to headlines or sound bites. When patterns start repeating across different industries, Rogan tends to slow the conversation down and ask the question most people avoid. In this case, it wasn't about defending anyone or making accusations. It was about noticing how familiar the structure felt. One highly visible figure takes the fall, the media cycle explodes, and then, almost quietly, the conversation hits a ceiling. That ceiling is what caught people's attention, not because Rogan claimed to know what's above it, but because he openly questioned why that part of the story rarely gets explored at all. And once that question is asked out loud, it's hard to ignore how often the same ending repeats. That's where the conversation took a sharper turn. As Rogan continued talking, he didn't focus on details or rumors, he zoomed out. Instead of asking what happened, he started asking why the outcomes keep looking the same. He compared the situation to past cases that followed an almost identical trajectory. Massive headlines, serious allegations, public shock, and then, somehow, no clear answers beyond the most visible name. And as he laid that comparison out, you could hear the moment where the conversation stopped being about one person and became about a system. This is the clip that pushed people to start connecting dots.
But then it's just another Epstein. It's another Ghislaine Maxwell, where somebody gets indicted
cases.
And nobody else. Indicted for trafficking kids to...
Right, to no one. Right. What is the next crazy thing that's going to explode in the news? Is Bill Clinton's going to have an OnlyFans? Like, what is going to happen?
What made that comparison hit so hard wasn't the names themselves. It was the structure behind them. One person gets charged, the story dominates headlines for weeks, and the public is told that justice is moving forward. But when people start asking who else was involved, the answers suddenly disappear. That's the part Rogan kept circling back to, not because he claimed to have inside knowledge, but because the official explanations never seem to line up with the scale of what's being described. Trafficking doesn't happen in isolation. Large operations don't run without infrastructure. And yet, the record almost always shows a single fall guy and the long list of unanswered questions. For many viewers, that's where discomfort set in. Not outrage, not shock, discomfort. Because once you notice the pattern, it becomes harder to unsee how often the same ending repeats. This is where many people started drawing comparisons to past cases, not because the situations are identical, but because the outcomes look eerily familiar. The Epstein case is often referenced for one simple reason. The way it officially concluded never matched the scale of what was described. One person was charged, another was convicted. And yet, despite years of reporting and testimony pointing to a much wider network, the record still shows no clear answers about who else was involved. That disconnect between allegations and accountability is what keeps resurfacing in public discussion. When Rogan brought this up, it wasn't framed as a theory. It was framed as a question. How does a trafficking operation exist without clients? How does a system run without beneficiaries? And why does the trail keep ending at the same point every time? As that comparison started circulating, attention naturally shifted toward familiar names, not because of new accusations, but because of past visibility. Public figures who had openly spoken about being around these environments suddenly became part of the conversation again. Old clips resurfaced, old interviews were replayed, and people began asking a simple question. If these spaces were as widely attended as they appeared to be, how did so many walk away without noticing anything at all? That question isn't an accusation, it's a reflection of how public perception works. When someone is seen repeatedly in the same circles, silence later on doesn't always feel neutral. It creates a gap, and gaps are where speculation tends to grow.
What is the next thing that's going to make us all go, what the f? Like, what the f is going on?
It's coming.
Like, how many guys were on video saying, ain't no party like a Diddy party? How many people like openly talked about being there?
LeBron?
Yeah, how Ashton Kutcher, all these people. Like, you guys all went, you didn't see nothing.
Around this point, another question started gaining traction. Not about who was guilty, but about what was getting covered at all. Some stories exploded across timelines instantly, while others barely made a ripple despite being widely discussed online. For a lot of viewers, that contrast felt strange, not because they expected answers, but because they expected consistency. When similar cases receive wildly different levels of attention, people naturally start wondering what determines which conversations move forward and which quietly fade out. That's where the focus shifts away from individuals and toward infrastructure. Every major industry has gatekeepers, executives, legal teams, distributors, and platforms that decide what moves forward and what quietly stalls. That doesn't require secret coordination. It's built into how large systems protect themselves. Risk gets managed, exposure gets minimized, and anything that threatens long-term stability often gets handled behind closed doors rather than in public view. When Rogan touched on this idea, it reframed the conversation, not as a story about hidden villains, but as a reminder that power doesn't always show itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up in what doesn't happen, the questions that never get followed up, and the stories that slowly lose momentum.
These words would come out my mouth, but Candace Owens is onto something, and that did not feel comfortable at all. So Candace says the reason mainstream news is not picking up this lawsuit, is not paying attention to Diddy at all, is because of this man right here, Lucian Grandage. He is one of the most powerful men in Hollywood and music. And he been up in Diddy's room. So this man right here is Sir Lucian Charles Grandage. He's been the CEO of Universal Music Group since 2010, so you know he done seen some shit. So I had to go to the damn documents. I had to see if this man was actually named, and he is. As you can see, it says Lucian Charles Grandage, and it also says Universal Music Group. On top of that, it says Ethiopia. I cannot fuck up her last name. I refuse to. But she was also a big person in Universal Music Group. And then Christina Coramham, Lord forgive. But she was like Diddy's second hand.
Once the conversation reaches this stage, it stops sounding abstract and starts feeling uncomfortable for a different reason. People begin asking how situations like this are actually handled behind the scenes, not in dramatic movie-style confrontations, but through quiet, very ordinary processes that most of the public never sees. In large industries, damage control rarely looks like public accountability. It looks like legal strategy. It looks like carefully worded statements, negotiated settlements, and agreements designed to make problems disappear rather than escalate. These aren't secret tactics. They're standard operating procedures whenever money, reputation, and long-term business interests are at stake. Non-disclosure agreements, for example, aren't inherently suspicious. They're used every day across entertainment, business, and politics. But when they become the default ending to serious allegations, they create a familiar pattern. Issues get contained instead of resolved, and public attention is quietly redirected elsewhere. Legal teams play a central role in this process. Their job isn't to answer moral questions, it's to minimize exposure. That often means delaying proceedings, narrowing the scope of investigations, or resolving disputes in ways that never require public explanation. Over time, momentum slows, headlines fade, and what once felt urgent becomes old news. This is why so many high-profile cases don't end with clarity. They end with silence, not because nothing happened, but because silence is often the most effective outcome for institutions that prioritize stability over transparency. When Joe Rogan talks about these patterns, this is the layer he's pointing toward. Not hidden puppeteers or secret commands, but systems designed to absorb shock and protect themselves. Once you recognize how those systems function, it becomes easier to understand why similar stories keep reaching the same quiet conclusion, and why real answers so often remain just out of reach.
Only one person.
Oh, go on.
And I call him Sean. That's Jay-Z. We call each other Sean.
Okay.
Yeah. Nobody else could call me Sean.
He's
You
the
know,
only person who's Sean approved.
There's not a single person that
Outside of family?
That should be, no, outside of my mother.
Okay,
That
just
should be calling me, that should be calling me Sean.
At this point, the focus shifts again not to new allegations, but to the reaction itself. Because whenever conversations move from individuals to systems, the tone around them changes. What starts as public curiosity often gets reframed as controversy, speculation, or something that shouldn't be entertained too seriously. That's what makes discussions like this feel uncomfortable to some people. They don't attack a single person or event. They question how power responds when it's challenged, and why certain topics trigger immediate pushback while others are allowed to run freely. The moment a conversation asks why patterns repeat, it stops being about entertainment and starts brushing up against structure. Joe Rogan has addressed this dynamic many times in different contexts, not by claiming hidden knowledge, but by pointing out how quickly conversations get shut down once they move beyond surface-level blame. It's not about proving anything, it's about noticing where curiosity suddenly becomes discouraged. For viewers, that creates a strange tension. On one hand, they're told transparency matters. On the other, they watch as deeper questions are labeled irresponsible, divisive, or dangerous to even explore. Over time, people learn where the invisible boundaries are. They learn which questions are safe and which ones quietly get you pushed to the margins. This is why Rogan's framing resonated with so many listeners. He wasn't presenting answers, he was highlighting their reaction to the questions themselves. And once you notice that reaction, the defensiveness, the dismissals, the sudden discomfort, it becomes part of the pattern too. Not proof of wrongdoing, but proof that some conversations are treated differently the moment they drift too close to power.
Between Diddy and Epstein, there's probably several thousand hours of footage here.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I should say, I think you voted for it.
I'd like to see a matchup of those, call it the top 100 puppet masters on the Epstein client list.
Do you think there's some overlap?
Strong overlap.
When are we going to see that list, do you think?
I don't know.
Will that ever come out, do you think?
You know, I think part of why Kamala is getting so much support is that if Trump wins, that Epstein client list is going to become public.
Yes.
And some of those billionaires behind Kamala are terrified of that outcome.
Yeah. Do you think Reid Hoffman's uncomfortable?
Yes. And Gates.
And Gates.
Yeah.
And I only ask that because you just look at them and you're like, that's a nervous person right there. I don't know. I mean, I assume you know them. Yeah.
Yes.
As these discussions evolve, another concept keeps resurfacing, not as an accusation, but as a way people try to make sense of repeated outcomes. It's often referred to as the facilitator model. The idea isn't that one individual masterminds everything, but that certain figures operate as intermediaries inside much larger systems. In this framework, the focus shifts away from intent and toward function. A facilitator doesn't need to control power directly. Their role is to create environments, manage access, and absorb risk. When problems arise, they're visible enough to take the hit, but not positioned high enough to expose anyone beyond them. That's why the same pattern appears across different industries and eras, even when the people involved change. What makes this model resonate with so many viewers is how familiar it feels. Large organizations don't rely on single points of failure. They build buffers. Layers of legal protection, public-facing figures, and complex partnerships exist precisely to prevent issues from climbing too high up the chain. When something breaks, the system doesn't collapse, it reroutes. This is also where comparisons between unrelated cases start to make sense to the public, not because the details match perfectly, but because the structure does. One name dominates the headlines, investigations move forward, then the conversation quietly narrows, and the broader network fades from view. When Joe Rogan and others talk about this idea, they're not presenting it as proof of hidden coordination. They're describing a pattern people recognize from corporate scandals, political crises, and financial collapses. Someone is always close enough to take responsibility, but rarely positioned to answer questions about the full system. Whether that interpretation is correct or not, it explains why so many people feel unsatisfied with official endings. The stories stop, but the structure that produced them remains unchanged, and that's what keeps the questions alive.
You have these guys, like a Jeffrey Epstein type guy, who works with the elite of the elite clientele. It's all movie stars, big-time politicians, world leaders, scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and they all meet together and have fascinating conversations and cocktails, and there's beautiful girls everywhere. Of course. What a great idea.
Right.
And if you're naive and you don't understand honeypots.
Here's the quote from Maria Farmer, who was one of the accusers from what was inside the house in New York.
Okay, she said, there were monitors inside this cabinet. I looked on the cameras and I saw toilet, bed, toilet, she said, visibly spooked. Like, I'm never going to use the restroom here and I'm never going to sleep here. You know what I mean? It was very obvious that they were like monitoring private moments. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. Maria Farmer was the one who worked at Epstein's office in New York, I think.
And this was the house, Jamie?
Yeah, I was looking up stuff on the house. That was like what they
I
found.
wonder if the
in
house still
too.
has fucking cameras in it somewhere that they haven't found yet.
They definitely, don't know.
Yeah, you'd have to scan the shit out of that house. You'd have to take the walls apart. There's probably listening devices inside the walls. Like, who knows? If this was like really an intelligence operation. Yeah, they probably had that house fully wired.
When you step back and look at everything laid out side by side, the picture becomes clearer. Not because there are definitive answers, but because the same questions keep resurfacing. Different names, different years, different scandals, yet the structure underneath rarely changes. What Joe Rogan highlighted wasn't a secret or a revelation pulled from thin air. It was a pattern people have seen before, one that becomes easier to recognize the more often it repeats. A single figure takes center stage, the story dominates attention, and then the deeper layers quietly fall out of focus. That doesn't automatically mean there's a hidden truth waiting to be exposed, but it does explain why so many viewers feel unsatisfied when these stories reach their official conclusions. The noise fades, the headlines move on, and the systems that allowed everything to happen remain largely untouched. In the end, this isn't about proving anything. It's about understanding why these conversations never fully settle, and why the same uncomfortable questions keep coming back. And that's really where this leaves us. Not with answers, but with a choice. Do we treat each case as an isolated incident, or do we acknowledge the similarities that keep appearing across industries, timelines, and power structures? Some people see coincidence, others see a pattern that deserves more attention. Wherever you land, the fact that these discussions keep resurfacing says a lot about how trust, transparency, and accountability are perceived today. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Joe Rogan is right to question why these stories tend to stop at the same point? Or do you believe people are reading too much into familiar outcomes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you found this breakdown interesting, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's been following this conversation too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.